Hey everyone, this is Kevin from the chesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be looking at round 2 from the 2015 Norway chess tournament. One of the biggest tournaments of the year. Pretty much all the big names are going to be playing here. Round 1 was pretty exciting when we saw Magnus Carlsen actually lose on time in a winning position. Didn't quite understand that the time constraints had changed from last year. And so he lost a winning position while he had the white pieces. So he's going to be looking for a comeback here in game 2. And I thought this would be a super exciting match because his opponent is the number 2 ranked player in the world, Fabiano Caruana, young superstar. And so we have the number 1 ranked player in the world, Fabiano, playing the white pieces, and Magnus Carlsen playing the black pieces, Magnus Carlsen being the world champion at the moment. So Fabiano starts out with pawn to e4, pawn e5, knight f3, knight to c6, bishop here to b5, the Rai Lopez, and then knight to f6 from Magnus Carlsen. This is the Berlin defense, a very strong defense. A lot of times you may hear it referred to as the Berlin Wall because it's so tough for white to really break through and find a victory. A lot of times this will end up in a draw, and Fabiano, I'm sure, is looking for more than that. He tied in the first round, knows that he's going to have to get some victories in this tournament to win. Magnus Carlsen on the other side wants to kind of make sure that he can come back, wants to play an opening that he's familiar with. He played the Berlin defense against Vichy Anand in the World Championship last year 3 times, so he's very, very familiar with it, plays it all the time, has a few different variations that we're going to see today, which are kind of exciting, some novelties in the opening, but all in all looking to be a very, very fun match. Fabiano castles on the king side, and then Magnus Carlsen takes here on e4. This is kind of the open variation. He plays this more than anything else. I also like to personally play bishop here to c5, kind of that classical line in the Berlin defense, but Magnus Carlsen, he has kind of prepared specifically for this, so he plays what he's comfortable, knight to e4, and then we see pawn to d4. These are kind of the main lines here. The knight's going to come back here to d6, bishop to c6, pawn taking here on c6, pawn taking here, knight over here to f5, queen take, king take, and then pawn to h3. And this is where we start to see some novelties in the game. We see Magnus Carlsen play pawn to h6. A lot of times in the World Championships, we would either see the king come here to e8. We might even see bishop here to d7. Both of the moves that we saw. Decides to go ahead and play pawn to h6. Playing pawn to h5 even later in the opening is something that black can do in the Berlin defense. So starting off with pawn to h6, something we don't always see. And then rook over here to d1, and then king here to e8. Now, if we look at the board, white definitely has a little bit of advantage as far as he's a little bit more established. His king right now is a little bit safer. It's not as big of a deal if your opponent's queen is off the board. Your king's fairly safe. Black does have the double bishop pair, so white's going to have to make sure that he continues to press forward. He does have kind of the spatial advantage here, because if Magnus Carlsen can keep this open board, get his double bishop pairs involved into the game, it's going to put a lot of pressure on Fabiano Caruana. So Fabiano needs to make sure that he controls the middle of the board with his rooks. He needs to make sure that his knights are both very active, and he continues to put pressure with these pawns on board. Knight here to c3. A knight coming back here to e7. This is also an interesting move. Magnus Carlsen playing somewhat of a novel line here that you don't see all that often. Usually from here, you'll see bishop here to e6. You may see bishop here to e7. Some common moves. Usually the knight here on f5 is going to stay here. Even in the World Championship, you saw pawn coming here to b6 and bishop coming here to a6, trying to control this long light square diagonal right here. But decides to go ahead and play something different. Plays knight here to e7, and then after pawn to b3, we see bishop here to f5. And this is something that Magnus Carlsen didn't think that Fabiano would be prepared for. After the match, as they kind of talked to both players, Fabiano said, yeah, I actually had looked at this specific line and was prepared for it and had a game plan for it. So it'll be interesting to see how both Fabiano's preparation versus Magnus Carlsen, who knows the Berlin defense maybe better than anyone, is going to play out in this match. With the bishop here on f5 attacking this pawn, Fabiano decides to go and bring his knight here to d4. centralizing his knight, but also protecting this pawn. Then we see the bishop come back here to h7, is being attacked, but Magnus Carlsen wants to maintain the pressure here on c2. And then we see bishop here to b2, just controlling this long, dark diagonal right here. Rook over here to d8, putting pressure on this knight right here. Black's goal is really to remove this defender right here. If this knight falls away, all of a sudden this pawn's going to fall to this bishop right here. So we see the knight come back here. That's great news. That's now protecting this knight here. And also, if this knight falls, can take its place with this knight and then still protecting right here. And this dark square bishop here on b2 is also protecting it as well. So Fabiano's doing a good job of kind of maneuvering his pieces around and still holding control of the important squares that he needs to. Knight here to e5, just more of a central square, does open up the board for this dark square bishop as well to get involved, which Magnus Carlsen definitely needs to do. Pawn up here to c4, threatening to move this knight. The knight comes back here to b4. Knight up here to f4 as well, trying to get ready to attack on the king side. And then rook over here to g8. Now this is another novelty that Magnus Carlsen said he prepared. It was interesting. Fabiano said he didn't like this move. Instead preferred maybe something more active like bishop here to e7, just getting it outside, protecting these dark squares a little bit more. Instead, we did see Magnus Carlsen play rook here to g8, so this was in his preparation. Now we see pawn to g4. So Fabiano decides, hey, I'm just going to start to attack with my pawns right here. And so he continues to move forward, and then knight to a6. And this is the first move where in the preparation I just don't understand why Magnus Carlsen decided for this. I think he has better options besides knight here to a6. There's no real threat. It's going to be very difficult for him. He's going to waste a lot of moves to kind of get this active over on the king side. As soon as I see pawn here to g4, I'm going to be looking to keep safe on the king side. I'm going to play bishop here to e7. I want things as safe as possible. I don't want to be worrying about my knight over here. But Magnus Carlsen decides to play knight over here to a6. Now knight here to f5, kind of shutting the door on this bishop here on h7, which is not what Magnus Carlsen is looking to do. Now knight over here to c5, as we kind of alluded to, Magnus Carlsen kind of using his moves to get his knight over on the king side. Rook up here to d8, exchange right here, and then to d1. So white has a much more active rook. This d1 is going to be able to fly around this entire board. This rook over here on g8 for Magnus Carlsen isn't doing much at all except protecting this pawn right here, and it's not going to be active for a while because there's not a lot of room for this dark square bishop here to get out anywhere. It's kind of blocked not only by its knight, but also this pawn right here on e5 is kind of a pain. So right now, Fabiano is doing a great job of controlling the game. He's being aggressive like he needs to. And Magnus Carlsen, he's just playing defense. His bishops aren't moving. His rook's not moving. His knight's kind of dancing around the board. Can now get it over on the king side and kind of help out in the defense, but really doesn't have a lot going for him right now. So he just needs to hold on and make sure he does not get out of this game down 0 tie, 0 wins, and 2 losses. That would definitely be very bad, especially since he's Norwegian and he's playing at the Norway Chess 2015 tournament. We now see Magnus Carlsen play a king to c8 and then bishop here to a3, attacking the knight. The knight's going to come back here to e6, finally made its way over to the king side. And then we see the knight take here on e6. Now, very important that Magnus Carlsen takes correctly. If he were to take, let's say, with his pawn here on e6, then all of a sudden Fabiano has a really creative move of bishop here to e7. We can clearly see that the bishop takes, the knight's going to take, that's going to fork the knight, that's going to be extremely bad. But if he doesn't take that, let's say he plays something else because he needs to get his king out, so let's say he plays the pawn here to b5, then just the rook's going to come up here, and then the bishop's going to take here on f8. The pawn is going to take the knight, but then this pawn's just going to start pushing up forward. It's going to be very, very difficult for black to do too much on board. So instead, Magnus Carlsen decides to go and take with his bishop, which is what he needs to do. But now the knight's going to come over here to g7 take. Still has this defender right here. Bishop has to come back to help, but then pawn to e6 is really, really difficult for Magnus Carlsen to deal with. He has to play precisely, and then he's still going to be in a lot of danger. So he takes with his bishop right here. He does not want to take incorrectly here as well. If he were to take with his pawn, then all of a sudden the knight's going to take, can either take either the bishop here, or we could see the rook come up here to d8. The bishop can't just come here to kind of stop that, because then the knight could take. It's just all sorts of bad news right here. But decides to go ahead and take correctly. Takes with his bishop here on f5, and then the knight takes, and now the pawn takes here on e6, and then this knight's going to come back here to g3. Fabiano decides he doesn't have to be too aggressive right now with his knight. He can kind of regroup a little bit. He doesn't have the pieces to kind of stay over there and be somewhat aggressive, but he has the better pawn structure. Both sides are equal in material, but really Fabiano has a much easier endgame. Anytime your opponent has one minor piece, and that is a bishop, all you have to do is put your pawns on the other color, and pretty much that bishop becomes useless. So Fabiano, he can just put all his pawns on light squares, and this dark square bishop is not going to be able to do too much. Yes, it can stop a promotion if it does want to. Let's say this pawn here on f2, it's eventually going to promote to f8. But besides that, the bishop's not going to be doing too much. So Fabiano definitely has a leg up right now. He also has a better pawn structure. He has 3 pawns on the king side. He can kind of overload the king side. It's going to be very difficult for Magnus Carlsen to kind of overload the queen side, since all his material right now is over on the queen or on the king side. So we see bishop here to e7, king up here to g2. Definitely want to make sure you get your kings involved into the game, especially middle to the late game when there's not as much big material on boards, the queens and the rooks to really put pressure on the king. There's no real mate threats that the king has to worry about, so it's an extra piece in the attack, so make sure you get it involved into the center of the board. Rook up here to f8, rook up here to d3. Both of these players getting into the end game. Fabiano just kind of maneuvering his pieces around. He wants to make sure he doesn't really put any of his pieces on the dark squares if he doesn't have to, but you know, pawn up here to f4 doesn't have to worry too much. This knight here on h5 is protecting that. Bishop here to a3 isn't doing too much at all. King up here to f3, just more and more pressure. See, Magnus Carlsen is not making any headway with his pawns, and Fabiano Caruana is continuously putting more and more pressure by pushing up his pawns even more. So king here to d7 does finally get his king involved into the game, but after a few more moves, we do see just too much pressure on board. Rook over here to e8, pawn up here to f5. Eventually one of these is going to break through, and then king here to f4. Doesn't even want to take with his king yet, although he could. Doesn't have to worry too much, but maybe decides doesn't want to just have to worry about rook here to f8 and then forcing the king to move. So instead decides to play a little bit safer, bring his king over here to f4 and then take with his knight. After the bishop comes, then Fabiano plays rook over here to g2. He's threatening both knight taking here on h6. He's threatening with the pawn pushing forward with both the knight and the rook here as protectors. This king just can't get involved soon enough, and so Magnus Carlsen is forced to resign and loses the first 2 matches. He's got to be pretty disappointed, especially after the first match. He felt like he had won. He was just sitting there trying to calculate the winning combination and ran out of time. Kind of a shock to all of us. So the Norwegian is currently getting destroyed in the Norway chess tournament. A lot of play left. We've got many, many more days left of tournament play. So Magnus Carlsen said he's going to come back fired up, and he thinks he can still win this thing. Fabiano Caruana playing fantastic chess. I think him or Nakamura is going to take this down. Both of them just extremely talented players. But all in all, really great match. Excited for this tournament. So many great games are going to be coming out of this tournament. So many top players. So if you have a favorite player, let me know. I'll try to make sure I do commentary on their match. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Number 1 versus number 2 in the world is always exciting in any sport, especially chess. And yes, chess, in my opinion, is a sport. So take that for what it is. And I'll see you guys in the next game. Thanks for watching, everybody.